I arrived in Blossom Hills with high hopes, seeking a peaceful suburban life in a place lauded for its manicured lawns and friendly neighbors. The tree-lined streets, each named after a flowering plant, gave the neighborhood a soft charm. A small creek wound behind the cul-de-sac, and a well-kept community park lay near the center, boasting bright flower beds and a modest playground. Yet almost from the start, I felt a subtle tension hanging over everything. The residents whispered about an HOA president, known for her iron grip on every detail, from the height of each hedge to the color of each door wreath. Her name was Karen Longwell, and though I'd barely heard it before moving in, her presence quickly loomed large over my new life. On move-in day, while I unloaded boxes from a rental truck, a tall, blonde woman with sharply styled hair approached. She wore a pastel sweater set, carrying a thick binder labeled Blossom Hills HOA. Smiling briefly, she introduced herself in a brisk tone. "Hello there, I'm Karen Longwell, the Homeowners Association president. Have you read our covenants? We expect strict compliance to keep this place pristine." Her gaze flicked across my yard, searching for violations. I assured her I'd read the packet, eager to avoid conflict. She nodded, handing me a bright pink notice referencing mandatory landscaping standards. Then, pivoting, she marched away to greet the next neighbor. I sighed, hoping her strictness wouldn't overshadow the community's promise of tranquility. Little did I know that months later, Karen would launch a fervent campaign to block an accessible playground project I'd helped organize, determined to keep anything commercial out of the neighborhood. Nor could I guess that her stubborn stance would be shattered by the arrival of a city council member in a wheelchair who'd reveal the playground's deeper significance. At the time, I only sensed that Karen's vigilance could pose future headaches, but I believed reason would prevail. How naive that hope would prove. While settling in, I discovered that Blossom Hills Central Park contained a small but outdated playground, a few swings and a slide, enough for the average toddler. Yet I noticed some children with disabilities in the neighborhood, a girl in a wheelchair, a boy with mobility challenges, and others with special needs. Observing them watch from the sidelines, unable to access the raised platform or the swings, tugged at my heart. In my previous city, I'd volunteered with a group that installed inclusive playground features, like ramps and supportive swings, ensuring kids of all abilities could play side by side. I soon realized Blossom Hills had no such accommodations. The single ramp into the sandbox was narrow, and the rest of the structure had steps. Wanting to help, I brought up the idea of an accessible playground upgrade at a casual HOA meet and greet. Most neighbors seemed intrigued, especially parents. Ms. Morris, a mother of 3, said her youngest used a walker and rarely got to enjoy the current structure. Others nodded, seeing the potential benefits. Even some seniors with grandchildren thought inclusive design would be wonderful. However, Karen, overhearing, arched an eyebrow, muttering about unnecessary expansions and keeping the neighborhood tidy. She questioned if it was really needed, stating that few children here had serious disabilities. I gently explained that even for a handful, inclusive play was transformative. She gave a curt nod, not outright opposing it yet, but I sensed her skepticism. She warned that any changes to the park had to pass the board's approval, plus comply with the aesthetic standards of Blossom Hills. I thanked her, determined to proceed carefully. In the following weeks, I gathered more info, emailing an inclusive design nonprofit and the local parks department about potential grants or city partnerships. The response was encouraging. The city sometimes co-sponsored accessible playground upgrades if the HOA or local donors chipped in. The plan wouldn't require mass overhaul, just adding ramps, supportive swings, maybe a wheelchair-friendly merry-go-round. The entire project was feasible if the community agreed. A sense of hope ignited in me, soon overshadowed by Karen's looming presence. With Ms. Jenkins, a supportive HOA board member, I drew up a proposal, a modest expansion of the existing playground, with an entry ramp, a specialized swing, and a small play area for wheelchair users. We scouted the area, noting where the ramp could attach, how to keep the design consistent with neighborhood style. Ms. Jenkins believed the board majority might approve, especially if the city helped fund it. She suggested we gather neighbor signatures, showing broad backing. Enthusiasm grew among families I spoke to. Ms. Morris shared how her wheelchair-bound daughter never found a local playground fully welcoming. Another neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, a grandfather to a boy with autism, said an inclusive space would benefit children with sensory needs. We quickly collected dozens of signatures. The city council representative for our district, Ms. Thompson, was rumored to be a strong advocate for accessibility. If we pitched it right, the city might provide partial funding. However, each time I canvassed the idea, Karen's disapproving gaze appeared. She rarely confronted me directly, but the rumor mill said she was calling the plan too commercial, turning the park into a public attraction. She worried about outsiders flooding in, although the city's plan would remain primarily for residents, with minimal outside traffic. Ms. Jenkins told me Karen had begun cornering board members, urging them to keep Blossom Hills refined, discouraging industrial-looking ramps. Tension simmered. I realized I'd need a formal board presentation to secure official HOA support before approaching the city. We scheduled the presentation for the next board meeting. In the meantime, I refined the design with Ms. Jenkins. We found pictures of tasteful ramps and colorful but discreet swings. We'd keep the overall aesthetic calm, with wooden elements blending into the existing playground. Ms. Jenkins believed once the board saw the emotional and practical benefits, they'd approve. I felt nervous, knowing Karen might object strongly. But I had faith in the community's heart. The day of the board meeting arrived. The community center was half full, mostly the usual group discussing landscaping fees or fence color compliance. When we reached the agenda item, Ms. Jenkins introduced me, praising the accessible playground concept. I stood, distributed some printed visuals describing the ramp, the specialized swing, the potential partial city funding. A few parents in the room nodded enthusiastically. Karen listened with a neutral expression at first. Then, as I detailed the ramp, she interjected, "This might conflict with our standard color schemes for playground equipment. We can't just add clashing structures." I assured her the design would match the existing color palette, gentle greens, browns, blending naturally. Another board member, Mr. Green, asked about the cost. Ms. Jenkins explained we'd apply for a city grant, plus some neighborhood fundraising. If successful, the HOA's portion would be modest. Karen pressed further, "And what about outsiders? If this becomes the only accessible playground in the area, we could get swamped by non-residents." Ms. Jenkins politely noted the park was technically a private HOA space, so full public access was limited, but the city might prefer partial openness. I suggested we could keep it primarily for residents, yet it might be open to accompanied guests. No huge influx was expected. Ms. Morris, the parent, shared how her daughter would benefit greatly. A wave of agreement rose among the board except Karen, who frowned. Ultimately, the board voted to give preliminary approval to proceed with the city application, 4-1 in favor, with Karen dissenting. I felt a surge of relief. Ms. Jenkins concluded that once we secured the city's partial funding, we'd finalize the project. Karen looked displeased but said nothing further. I assumed that signaled acceptance, though Ms. Jenkins warned me that Karen might attempt sabotage in the future. I hoped rational minds would prevail. With the board's preliminary nod, Ms. Jenkins and I approached the city's parks department. They were thrilled about the prospect, praising the idea of a model accessible playground in a suburban HOA. They had funds earmarked for inclusive design. They introduced us to Ms. Thompson, the city council member who championed disability-friendly initiatives. Ms. Thompson, a dynamic leader who used a wheelchair herself after an accident years ago, was excited to see a private community wanting to adopt universal design. She tentatively pledged partial funding if the HOA provided official endorsement and coverage of certain installation fees. As Ms. Jenkins and I got the paperwork in order, we discovered one complication. The city needed a formal letter from the HOA stating unconditional support for the project, verifying the entire board was on board. Our prior, preliminary approval wasn't enough, as Karen had voted no. Ms. Jenkins believed the rest of the board could overrule her easily, but we had to present a final resolution. Ms. Thompson indicated she might like to attend a meeting or see the site in person, especially to confirm the area's readiness for ramps and specialized swings. Ms. Jenkins felt this was a great chance, but we had to ensure a unanimous or near-unanimous endorsement to show unity. I braced for friction. Karen, still the HOA president, possessed the power to set meeting agendas, influence the other board members, or push her negative viewpoint. Ms. Jenkins recommended we gather more neighbor support, ensuring a strong presence at the next meeting so Karen couldn't override the majority. Meanwhile, I refined design details: ramp gradient, supportive seats, color scheme matching existing equipment. The final blueprint looked elegant, not commercial, contradicting Karen's fears. Little did I guess the lengths Karen would go to. She soon posted on the HOA forum, warning that an overly large ramp structure might degrade property values, that the city's involvement would open the park to excess traffic. She called the specialized equipment industrial eyesores. Some neighbors were swayed by her alarmism. Others found it heartless. A rift emerged in Blossom Hills, leaving me anxious about the outcome. As the date for the official board vote neared, Karen ramped up her campaign, framing the accessible playground as a drastic commercial project that would ruin the neighborhood's aesthetic. She circulated a flyer showing exaggerated images of a gaudy structure overshadowing the entire park. She claimed it would attract outsiders from all over the city, turning quiet Blossom Hills into a public thoroughfare. Many recognized her claims as hyperbole, but a few older residents worried about losing the exclusive feel they cherished. Ms. Jenkins tried countering with facts. The final design was relatively small-scale. The city recognized HOA ownership, so outside usage would be minimal. The new equipment was tasteful, matching the existing color scheme. Meanwhile, Ms. Thompson, the wheelchair-using city council member, emailed Ms. Jenkins a note offering to visit and address residents' concerns personally. She believed a direct conversation could dispel misunderstandings and highlight the project's inclusive value. Karen, upon hearing Ms. Thompson might come, allegedly told some board members she'd prefer not to invite external politicians. She scorned the idea of political grandstanding in our private community. Ms. Jenkins, however, liked Ms. Thompson's idea, seeing it as a chance for neighbors to meet a real-life example of how accessible design transforms lives. Ms. Jenkins assured Ms. Thompson she was welcome to attend the upcoming board meeting, overshadowing Karen's reluctance. Meanwhile, Ms. Morris, mother to the girl in a wheelchair, tearfully confided that Karen's rhetoric felt deeply hurtful. She dreaded speaking up at the next meeting, but Ms. Jenkins insisted her voice was crucial. I comforted Ms. Morris, vowing to support her. The fate of the accessible playground hinged on that final board vote, with Ms. Thompson's presence possibly tipping the scale. Tension soared, as many predicted a dramatic confrontation between Karen's fearmongering and the forces of inclusivity. Days before the decisive board meeting, Ms. Jenkins informed me that Karen was quietly contacting the HOA's lawyer, seeking an interpretation that the new equipment would violate the "no major structural modifications" clause in the community's covenants. Ms. Jenkins said typically that clause referred to altering building exteriors or property lines, not updating a communal playground. However, Karen apparently wanted a legal opinion to claim the accessible features were major modifications. If the lawyer sided with her, the board might shy away, fearing lawsuits. At the same time, Karen posted a second flyer, citing alleged insurance liabilities if the playground included specialized swings or ramped walkways. She claimed kids might get hurt and parents might sue the HOA. Ms. Jenkins was exasperated, explaining that the city's standard design included safe, tested equipment with liability coverage if installed per guidelines. But Karen's scare tactics sowed doubt among some board members, especially Ms. Carter, who worried about possible lawsuits. Ms. Jenkins urged Ms. Carter to read the actual city policies. Ms. Thompson, hearing of these developments, reaffirmed her readiness to speak at the next meeting. Meanwhile, Ms. Morris said if the project fell through, she might move to a more welcoming area, an outcome that weighed heavily on us. The entire enterprise, meant to promote joy and equality, teetered under Karen's relentless sabotage. As the board meeting approached, Miss Jenkins scheduled a site walk of the playground with Miss Thompson, inviting all board members to see the exact spots for ramps and swings. Karen refused to attend, calling it a dog and pony show. Miss Jenkins, Miss Thompson, and a few neighbors walked the park, admiring how short ramp from the sidewalk to the playground's platform would barely disrupt the space. Miss Thompson navigated her wheelchair easily on the wide walkway leading to the playground, but the structure itself had steps. She patted the platform's edges, imagining where the ramp would attach. Miss Jenkins filmed a short clip to show the board. Miss Thompson said softly, "It's a small change for you, but a huge difference for kids like me, back in the day." Her words resonated with us. If only Karen had come to witness it. At last, the evening of the board meeting arrived. The community center bustled with tension. Karen, seated at the table center, wore a pastel suit, piles of documents in front of her. Beside her sat Ms. Jenkins, Mr. Brown, Ms. Carter, and Mr. Larson. I joined a large crowd of neighbors, many wearing small pins that read "Inclusive Play." Ms. Morris and her wheelchair-using daughter, Ms. York, Mr. Alvarez, all sat together. Ms. Thompson quietly entered, wearing a professional blazer, her wheelchair rolling smoothly over the polished floor. Her presence turned heads, a sign of official city interest. Karen's expression tightened upon seeing her. Following routine matters, we reached new playground equipment final vote. Karen kicked off with a prepared speech. She claimed the new features were overly commercial, would attract large crowds, and posed legal risks. She brandished a letter from the HOA lawyer who recommended caution but didn't explicitly forbid it. She twisted it to imply the project was legally shaky. Ms. Carter looked uncertain, Ms. Jenkins frowned, and the audience stirred restlessly. Then Ms. Jenkins countered with the official city stance. Partial funding was available, liability coverage was standard, and the minor ramp modifications wouldn't degrade property values. She introduced Ms. Thompson. "We're honored to have Councilmember Thompson here to share her perspective." Karen tried to protest, but Ms. Jenkins motioned for Ms. Thompson to speak. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on Ms. Thompson as she wheeled to the front. She began softly, addressing the board and neighbors. She recounted how, after her accident, she struggled to find accessible recreational spaces. She emphasized that inclusive design isn't about bringing in outsiders, but ensuring all residents, including disabled children, can enjoy the same facilities. She pointed to Ms. Morris's daughter, who had never played on a local swing. She explained the city's standard approach to such expansions, clarifying that liability concerns were minimal if the HOA followed official guidelines. She concluded, "Voice resolute, this project stands for equality and community spirit. I urge you to pass it wholeheartedly. Blossom Hills can be a shining example of modern, inclusive design." Applause erupted from the audience, many rising to their feet. Ms. Thompson nodded graciously. Karen sat stiffly, lips pressed, as if uncertain how to respond. Ms. Carter, swayed by Ms. Thompson's testimony, looked moved. Mr. Brown noted the moral argument. Why exclude kids with disabilities? Ms. Jenkins promptly called for a vote. Karen tried a final defense. Our aesthetics. We must preserve the neighborhood's quiet character. Ms. Jenkins, unimpressed, insisted they consider the community's broader good. The vote proceeded. Ms. Jenkins, yes. Mr. Brown, yes. Ms. Carter, yes. Mr. Larson, yes. Karen, no. The tally was 4-1 in favor. An explosion of cheers, clapping, even some tears from Ms. Morris. Ms. Thompson smiled warmly. Karen's dissent was overshadowed. Ms. Jenkins declared the motion to adopt the inclusive playground plan had passed, and the city's partial funding would proceed. Karen was left speechless, overshadowed by the council members' authority and the neighborhood's moral consensus. With the board's official endorsement, the inclusive playground project moved forward. Ms. Thompson's presence had sealed Karen's defeat. The local paper carried a short piece, praising Blossom Hills for embracing accessibility, featuring a photo of Ms. Thompson touring the playground site. They mentioned some resistance from a minority, alluding to Karen. The entire fiasco left her in an awkward position. Some neighbors confronted Karen about her negativity. Ms. Morris's family, especially, expressed relief, but also anger that Karen tried to sabotage something so obviously beneficial. Others who once sided with Karen's strict approach began questioning her leadership. Ms. Jenkins told me rumors swirled about a possible recall if Karen continued undermining community interests. But for now, the main result was that Karen had lost massive credibility. She'd insisted on gloom and doom predictions about an ugly commercial structure, only to see the city's top official with a wheelchair praising the design as beautiful and inclusive. Karen, apparently humiliated, stayed away from subsequent design planning sessions. Ms. Jenkins oversaw final detail negotiations with the city. The specialized swing and ramp design were quickly drawn up by an engineering firm. A finishing date was set for early summer. Ms. Morris's daughter bounced with excitement at the news. Blossom Hills residents donated funds to cover the HOA portion. The entire project soared on a wave of positivity. Meanwhile, Karen's only recourse was to brood, overshadowed by the city council's unwavering support. As the new equipment arrived, a cheerful sense of triumph pervaded the neighborhood. Many watched as construction crews installed the ramp, the supportive swings, and bright signs indicating accessible playground, all are welcome. Karen tried complaining about the color of the ramp rails, a soft teal that matched the main structure, but Ms. Jenkins brushed her aside, referencing the board's official approval. Karen's authority had evaporated. Finally, the day of the playground's grand opening arrived. The city arranged a modest ribbon-cutting ceremony. Ms. Thompson, Ms. Jenkins, Mr. Brown, the local press, and dozens of families gathered around. Ms. Morris's daughter, beaming in her wheelchair, got to cut the ribbon with Ms. Thompson's help. A cheer rose as the ramp was declared open. Kids of all abilities rushed forward, laughing together, testing the swings, the ramp, the supportive seats. Seniors watched from benches, smiling at the scene of unity. Karen hovered at the fringe, arms crossed, face drawn, overshadowed by the crowd's celebration. When Miss Thompson gave a short speech, praising the collective spirit that overcame doubt and naysayers, many turned to glance at Karen. She clenched her jaw. Miss Jenkins then recognized me, Ms. Morris, and other neighbors who championed the project. Another wave of applause swelled, leaving Karen looking isolated. In that moment, Miss Jenkins pulled me aside, quietly informing me that the board planned an internal vote to remove Karen from the presidency. Her repeated attempts to block the city partnership, disregard for the board's majority, and smear campaign had eroded trust. The final straw was how she tried to sabotage the official opening by complaining about petty color issues, ignoring the project's enormous benefit. With Ms. Thompson's presence, the entire neighborhood recognized Karen's negativity was unrepresentative. Sure enough, a week later, the board voted unanimously to remove Karen from her post, citing persistent obstruction of a duly approved community improvement project. The membership ratified it, 73% in favor, effectively dethroning her. A letter went out, explaining the reasons, pointing to the city's involvement and how Karen's attitude almost cost them partial funding. Neighbors who once feared her recognized her approach as petty, borderline ableist. Thus, Karen Longwell faced her final punishment, stripped of the HOA presidency, publicly shamed for her unyielding hostility toward an inclusive cause. No longer controlling anything, she lingered in Blossom Hills with a tarnished reputation. Freed from her obstruction, the new playground thrived. The city's coverage labeled Blossom Hills a beacon of modern, inclusive neighborhoods, an example of how small changes can bring big transformations. Ms. Morris's daughter soared on the supportive swing, Ms. Jenkins oversaw the community with fairness, and we all savored the victory over misguided tyranny. The neighborhood, united by empathy, outshone one woman's petty quest for uniformity. Ending, Karen is punished. As a final note, Karen, dethroned and humiliated, withdrew from public life in Blossom Hills, her status eroded by the unstoppable momentum of inclusivity and compassion. The once overbearing HOA Karen discovered that no personal vendetta could stand against a community's resolve and the unwavering support of a city council champion who knew, firsthand, the power of accessible design.